Hello and welcome to the show Mental Health Matters. I'm your host, Lisa and Butcher. Today we're going to be doing actually a really important show, especially leading into the holidays. I've done a variety of different shows, several episodes we filmed about anxiety, depression, or otherwise. Today we're going to be talking, basically having an open discussion about suicide. The purpose of this would be to sort of normalize discussion around it. I know it's something a lot of people struggle with at the holidays. Generally holidays are not associated for some people with happiness and family, etc. Some people don't feel that. They really struggle at this time. So I think it's a super important topic to talk about. I'm joined today by Melinda Freitas. She is a full-time counselor at our Yaletown office for Three Sisters Counselling. She has over 30 years of experience working in a variety of different settings, everything from hospitals to safe houses, helping people through domestic violence. She's also worked with the police in terms of supporting people who have been maybe families of people who have suicided in the past. So welcome, Melinda, to the show today.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thanks for joining us. I mean, there's a lot of stats about suicide, right? And I think it shocks a lot of people when you start talking about statistics. I did a little bit of research before this show, and I was really shocked to see. I mean, I am a mental health counselor, as are you, and obviously we talk to
Mhm.
a lot of people about depression and sort of their thoughts of suicide. But suicide is up. And I mean, I have to say this has become something since COVID specifically that we've really addressed, especially in practice. 12 people per day in Canada actually suicide. And I would say that is a low stat. I have to say, they say 4,500 per year. This is only in Canada. I think it's generally perceived to be sort of across the board, men, women, doesn't matter who it is, it's equal. It's actually a lot higher in men specifically, which is interesting because we talk about sort of that culture of not talking or sort of that culture of silence, right? and
Yeah.
and I think it's really important to sort of openly discuss this on the show today. So let's talk a little bit about suicide and what you see in your practice, specifically sort of what is it when we have suicidal ideation? What does it mean when I'm having thoughts about suicide?
Thanks again, Lisa, for hosting. I think this is a really important topic. Suicidal thoughts, an ideation doesn't necessarily mean that someone is going to harm themselves, but they are generally thoughts or ideas centered around the topic of death and suicide. Um, it can be a warning sign. It should be taken very seriously if someone is speaking about it or opening up or sharing. And as you mentioned, in terms of statistics, when people are not talking about it or not seeking the help, or asking for support, their thoughts are more likely to get more problematic, pervasive, that sort of thing. But talking about death in general doesn't necessarily make someone suicidal. It is a cause for concern, certainly. We want to pay attention. We certainly don't want to dismiss someone who is perhaps having those thoughts. And there's different levels, which I think we wanted to kind of explore about as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up about different levels. So I find in my practice, and anyone watching this is going to maybe identify with this, is, our brains sometimes trick us, and I'll have people come into my office and say, well, am I suicidal? Like, I feel like when I'm driving, sometimes I get this really strong urge to just like, what if I turned the car this way? Or what if I did that? Does that mean that I have suicidal thoughts? And generally, I mean, there's different thoughts that we have, right? Sometimes there's sort of what we call intrusive thoughts, where something like that will happen. That would be an example of an intrusive thought. Other people will come to me and they'll say, and I'm sure they come to you, they'll say, I have sort of more pervasive thoughts of suicide, comes up more often for me. Other times they'll say, I have actually maybe a plan to do it. And sometimes people are very open about talking about this, and other times they're really afraid to even mention it, to the point where I
Mm-hmm.
find in session, I'll sort of say, well, do you have thoughts of killing yourself? And they just look so relieved where they can actually freely discuss that. So tell me a little bit about what the different levels are. You just sort of mentioned levels. We talk about sort of ideation versus a plan versus intent. How do you look at that?
Yeah, I look at it from this framework of sort of passive suicidal ideation versus active suicidal ideation. You touched on several things there that I want to circle back to. So, first of all, any conversation about suicide at all or self harm at all should be taken seriously, even if it's a passing remark. But someone who is passively suicidal or having suicidal ideation, generally there isn't a particular desire or plan of action to harm themselves. Thoughts might be more random. They may be driven by, a stressful situation like sadness about a relationship that has ended. They may be really distraught. They have a fleeting thought about self-harm. They may be quite active in terms of seeking out help, or wanting to talk about what they're thinking or what they're feeling. Active suicidal ideation, a little bit different. These thoughts are going to motivate someone to actually create an action plan of self-harm. And it's interesting because once that plan is in place, they may feel more at ease and they may become more withdrawn. So those are, family or friends that you notice that are just more at ease in their life than they've been, or they, withdraw from life. They withdraw from activity. Someone who is actively suicidal, so having that active suicidal ideation, may in fact display certain warning signs, things you want to pay attention to. So, for example, giving away their valued belongings, having certain thoughts, really problematic thoughts or thought processes, significant changes in mood. I remember, clients talking about who had attempted suicide, that they were to the point of staying awake all night long. Other warning signs: they may write notes or emails to friends or family. And a significant sign for those of us who work in counseling is anyone who describes their specific means, or that they have access to the means for suicide, such as the pills that might be at home. So those are the two differences. And I would say if you're supporting someone that you suspect is thinking about this, or they have these, random or a little bit more problematic suicidal thoughts, you got to ask questions. You got to, be present and just show support.
Mhm. It's important too. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that about it's really important to engage in that conversation. A lot of people are really afraid, and I've heard this before from parents of children who are depressed or otherwise, and they say, "Well, I don't really want to bring it up because what if they're not thinking about it?" And I always say, "What if they are thinking about it?" And I think
Yeah.
it's so important to it's so much better to just say, and it's not like anything you ask is going to drive them to do that. It's actually very freeing, as I say, for people when you sort
Mhm.
of just call it, and is that what you're feeling? Yes, that's what I'm feeling, and I think it's super helpful for them to feel like they're supported, like other people understand them. Certainly I have to say, from a counseling perspective, something that is not helpful if you are a parent of someone who let's say one of your children is struggling, I find something that's especially not helpful is for you to describe how you have had those feelings before and how it went away for you, or this is what I did, don't worry about that. I've heard parents say, we just need to be busier, you just need to get more friends, you just need to X, Y, or Z. That can be quite dismissive. While I see people are trying to be helpful, sometimes it's not that easy for the child. And I've heard that specifically sort of, oh, well, when I was younger, I had that and this is what I did. And although that's anecdotal and sometimes, very rarely, can be helpful, more oftentimes it's dismissive. So I think just being there present to hear the person and what it is that they're struggling with. On another note about, yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, that's such an important point because there's already a sense of something is failing in life, and to be compared to someone who is able to lift themselves up. Oh, well, if you just exercise more or walk it off or whatever. Yeah, you're right. It's so dismissive. It minimizes that person's experience and whatever they are going through. And it might be that relationship that's ended and they really don't have the coping, or they don't understand what they might need, in terms of support in order to move past it and get through that intense time. But yeah, that sense of failing or failure, I have heard that so many times from clients that I've worked with who had actually survived an attempt. I would say that would be the top two or three reasons why they decided to take their life.
Mhm. And, when I was talking about statistics earlier, I sort of looked it up thinking, okay, what are the actual statistics for people who have suicided? So it said 12% had thoughts in life in the past about suicide. 4% had actual plans, and then 3% had previous attempts. Now, I still honestly think that's low. It's interesting. I mean, well, yeah, I do. I honestly think it's low. I mean, I think any stat we've actually recorded, I mean, arguably we've always missed a lot, I think, just in my sort of experience, no matter what we're looking at stats on. Especially since COVID specifically, that has been a huge struggle, as everybody in counseling knows, and actually everybody in the world, to be honest. A lot of people struggled mentally during COVID. There were very few people that thrived, I have to say. Even people who did not struggle with mental health before COVID found themselves struggling with mental health, and it hasn't recovered. I have to say, despite the fact that we're not under isolation anymore the same way and all these things, it has not recovered. And I think there's a worry amongst people who are still struggling with those lingering feelings. Um, Sort of, let's say, moving on from that, if my loved one, let's say, or even myself, let's say, is struggling with thoughts of suicide, what is important to do? So let's start with myself. So if I myself am watching this and I'm struggling with thoughts of suicide, what are some things that I should be doing?
So talking about it, or just find someone to talk to, first and foremost. And if you're supporting someone that is coming to you and saying, I'm having these thoughts, um, I'm going to describe maybe a little bit of the risk, or an assessment of risk that we work with.
Mm-hmm.
And that runs from low to moderate to high risk to imminent risk. Um, so ideation alone, I would try to, start with the person. If it's you, Lisa, where are you at in terms of this, of these thoughts? And ideation, of course, is it's important if someone says, this is what I'm thinking about, but using very direct language with that person, especially if it's a friend or family member. Asking specific questions. How often do you think about this? That determines the frequency of thoughts. Have you ever tried to harm yourself? Determines the level of risk. And also to gather information. So we've talked about things like what's happening in their life, what's changed, what's causing this stress. Expressing concern and taking the situation as serious is critical. And keep in mind that anyone who bravely shares that they're having these thoughts, they are reaching out for help. The people that are quite withdrawn and never ever speak about this, if they're more at the higher imminent risk, that they don't speak about this, that is dangerous at a different level. And I'll talk about that in a second. But if someone is speaking about it, they are asking for help. They're stuck. They're looking for an opportunity to find that help. And it may just start with the one person that they're sharing. It might be, friend or family member. And that's where you can start talking about the support that's available, things like the crisis center, suicide hotline, kids help phone to start.
Yeah, and on that note, actually, we have throughout this entire episode numbers for you to call at the bottom. It's actually, I mean, Kids Help Phone, many people have heard about, but another option is 988, and that's a suicide crisis line. You can actually text or call, and I'm so glad to see that you can text. I have to say that is the way of the future. I shouldn't say, I
Yeah.
mean, I always sort of make fun of myself that I'm sort of from 1940 and I'm not technologically savvy, but I have to say text is how people communicate now. And it's so much easier for them to sort of expose their thoughts when it's through communicating by texting versus conversation. And I think that's a huge sort of plus that we're doing now, that we're allowing people to access the help that way. I
Yeah.
really love, Melinda, that you said that when people bravely disclose that they're having these thoughts. Isn't that so true? Because a lot of people will come into a counseling session, whether it's online or in person, and the first thing they say is sort of their shame around the thoughts that they're feeling. They feel like
Yeah.
it shows that they're weak. They feel like it's a sign of their weakness or their failure or their inability to cope. And actually,
Mm-hmm.
it's the bravest thing you can do. It's the hardest thing you can do is to talk about something that is vulnerable to you and something you're worried about that's happening inside of yourself. And that's why I think it's so important as counselors and as parents, as friends, that we sort of just level it and just, hey, tell me what's going on for you. This is a safe space, and not try and jump in with solutions. Sometimes it's just actually allowing the person to have that space to communicate how it is that they're feeling. Um,
It's
when you say,
normalizing it.
mm,
It's normalizing a conversation about a really difficult topic that many people suffer at some point in their life. You know, it's very common to have stress. It's common to have issues that are really feel so overwhelming. And just as the stats are underrepresented here, I think more people might have those fleeting thoughts and they're really fearful of them. So yeah, let's normalize it. Let's the support is there for people, but you might be that one person that is um, who's chosen, if someone is reaching out to talk, certainly to show that compassion in what they're doing, and acknowledging the bravery in them reaching out.
mhm. And let's shift gears a little bit, because I wanted to talk about the idea that I often hear from other people. Well, they'll say, well, they feel it's selfish to suicide, so they're only thinking of themselves. And I have to say, I mean, it's hard to hear as a counselor because I see how much people struggle, as you do. But that is a view that some people hold, that that's a selfish thing to do. And I think what jumps out to me, and I've said this actually in two previous episodes, actually, is talking to people with specifically depression. I remember this client I had years and years ago, and he said to me this statement that has always stuck with me. He said, I don't understand why people say that life is so short, because for me, life feels so incredibly long. And I think that speaks to that mindset of how difficult life can be for people, and how one can't sit back if they've never experienced that and say, well, that's a selfish thing to do. Why wouldn't they just do this? Because they don't have the same coping skills, the same underlying mental health issues, the same lack of support, sometimes the same trauma from before. And I mean, there's a whole host of reasons why people have suicidal thoughts. So, can we speak a little bit to that about, let's say, demystifying sort of that idea that it would be a selfish thing to do?
Gosh, how much time do we
Yeah.
have? Absolutely no judgment. Seek to understand. Approach anyone who is struggling with compassion. I think the world needs a whole lot more of that. The world is very complex. People have their reasons for their sadness. And as you say, there's so many reasons why um, this may seem like the only thing left. And it really is more common than folks realize. We see it because this is our work. This is, and certainly not every single client, but we see this, and we talk to folks about this. But I just, you know I have sat at the bedside of someone in a hospital again who did not complete, and there's so many reasons, really valid ones, where they felt that this was the only option that they had. um, no judgment. Start with compassion and just really understand that there may be despair, things like guilt or anguish that someone is feeling, um, that they just don't know how to process it. And if they were given or had support, then they could absolutely begin to dismantle that. But yeah, we're a society that's quite quick to just look for that quick remedy. Like, well, how come you're not just this or that? And it doesn't
So
it
true.
doesn't work like that for everyone. And there's many historical components to suicide. We know the impacts of historical trauma. We know how that's impacted populations in our country. You just have to begin with compassion.
Yeah. And I mean, we speak a lot in this episode about prevention of suicide, how it's important to speak to people, how it's important to allow them that space, what to do if we know people who are having active suicidal thoughts or even passive suicidal thoughts, just that support for that person. What about the people who are dealing with the loss of a loved one for suicide? So I know your background is you've worked in police services, working with families who have, are survivors of people who have not survived a suicide attempt. So talk about the support that they need. What are they left with when someone suicides?
Oh boy, this is a really important question and a topic. Suicide bereavement is really unique. And In my experience, it's unlike any other grief. The intensity and the range of emotions that are unfamiliar and overwhelming and uncontrollable for families left behind, and it's quite normal for feelings of shock and anger. I mentioned, someone who has had thoughts of suicide or had attempted that they may be feeling that anguish and despair. Well, that's really what families are left with: the guilt of what has happened, um, the despair, their anger, just a really, really intense emotions. It's so important to reach out to get help if this happens, and to also recognize that there's no blueprint for grief in general. It's a journey, it's a process that's unwanted, it's uncomfortable, it's difficult to address. People are uncomfortable just to say, hey, I'll hold space for you. But it's and this particular grief is very unnatural, which is why no one wants to go through it. But support for families, support for anyone who has been impacted or touched by suicide. Again, I come back to the statement about compassion, no judgment, whatever the person needs in order to help them process all their feelings, all the range of emotions. And help is, people will get through it. Families will be able to um, deal with or handle their bereavement, but they absolutely can't do it alone, and they need to be able to reach out to and have that professional support.
Mm-hmm. You bring up a good point about that guilt that people who are left behind feel. And that's something I hear often. And I know when I practice in my practice doing trauma therapy for people, one of the things we do is we look at underlying narratives that people have. So, sort of the things that have happened in your life, what has that left you with? A
Mhm.
maybe view about yourself or a view about the world. And one of the things we always talk about is the statement, I'm responsible for everything and everyone. And I often feel that families of people who have suicided or friends will feel that it is their responsibility to either have kept their mental health okay, to have done something to prevent the suicide, that they should have or could have done more. And I often bring it back when I'm doing grief counseling about things to go back to your underlying narrative cannot be that you are responsible for everything and everyone, because then that becomes your fault in your mind, and that's part of what people deal with is that grief and loss, but also could I have done anything differently, and that's putting a lot of responsibility on yourself. So I think part of that self-compassion that we like to sort of speak to people about is having compassion for you are not responsible for everyone and everything and everyone. And yes, there's something to be said for helping people get resources, being a listening ear, but not one of those things is more important than the other. Not one of those things is necessarily going to save someone versus the other. I think a lot of people struggle with, well, I did this, but what if I had have done that? What if I had have been able to go to that person's house when they called me versus just talking to them? And I
Yeah.
and I always say there shouldn't be this hierarchy of if I only had have done this, it could have saved someone. I think we have to be
Mhm.
self-compassionate about what we have done, and also recognize there are factors beyond our control, that are important to sort of grieve the loss of.
Yeah, you're so right. And the conversation, and as difficult as it is to acknowledge or admit or recognize, is that everything could have been done, and it may not have saved their friend or their family member. And that's a hard reality for you know people to. It takes a long time to accept that. It's hard language to use, and I wouldn't obviously say like day one of therapy, hey, this is what you need to accept. But it is a reality. Um, and yeah, the guilt is. I think guilt is probably the first big emotion that they have to work through. They have to find space because it's quite expansive, and it goes into all those questions like you just said. What if I had done this? What if that?
Mm-hmm.
And they almost have to find those answers through their grieving and their bereavement. They have to find answers to those questions, and sometimes it's you just won't, you just can't. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's such a hard topic, and I think especially coming at a time where we're leading up to the holidays. I mean, for some, the holidays is so exciting. You know, they're so happy, and they look forward to spending time with friends or family. Or I mean, even the two of us, ironically, are both wearing a bit of red today, and and then there are other people who absolutely dread this time. And I think it's important to talk about this topic now because I think leading into this time, interestingly, in counseling, I mean, we always say as counselors, and any counselor watching this will totally identify with it, counseling bookings decrease kind of June, July, and August, right? Because everybody's maybe on their boat or they're out
Yeah.
or they're whatever. When it is massively increased is November, December, January, huge increase. And I think it shows the amount of people who are struggling with depression and or thoughts of suicide or suicidal ideation or planning or otherwise. So I do want to leave everyone with some resources. And no matter what city you are in, you always want to remember that any thoughts of attempting suicide or active suicidal ideation is a mental health emergency. Okay, so that is, if you get nothing else from this episode, that's what I want to leave people with, that it is something that you should be going to the emergency room for. Okay, it's not something that you should be taking lightly. It's better to go and have them say it's okay and send you home than it is for you to not go and then struggle with that yourself. The other thing that's really important resource wise is having that person that you can call. If you don't have someone in your life, either, let's say relationship wise or friendship wise or family wise, then you need to have a professional that you can call. There are on-call services in terms of counseling. We have two resource numbers at the bottom. One's for the Kids Help Phone and one is for the Suicidal Crisis Line that you can text or call to. And I think the other thing to remember is no matter what city you're in, there's always sort of mental health intakes. So you'll have mental health intakes at the hospital or at a urgent care center as well, depending on what city you're in. Any other resources you can think of, Melinda, in terms of what people can do if they're struggling over the holidays feeling suicidal?
Just tell one person.
Hmm, good
Just talk to
advice.
one person. Find someone that you can trust, and it's better to talk than not. Even if you think that no one will understand, somebody else, you'd be surprised.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about just how we can curtail when someone is becoming more and more suicidal. We can intervene with that support, that intervention. That's critical. But I just say just talk to one person.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not me, then reach out to someone.
Mm-hmm. Such great advice. Talk to one person. I love that that's the last line actually, because it's so true. And I think that can be so life saving for people is to just reach out to one person. If you or anyone else is struggling with mental health, obviously our clinic does specialize in seeing people for a variety of different issues, and specifically suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety. You can reach us on the internet at threesisterscounseling.com. Melinda has a full practice in Yaletown and also does online as well, so you can reach her through our website. You could also give us a call. If the internet is not your thing, you can give us a call at 778-222-7778. And we will get you booked in as soon as possible. As I said before, mental health can be a crisis situation. And I think that it's important if you're having suicidal ideation to reach out for help, and we will get you booked in. And if not in our clinic, refer you to the appropriate resource for the level of stress that you're experiencing. So with that said, thank you so much, Melinda, for joining us today. I think that was a really, really important topic to discuss.
My pleasure. Good to see you, and nice to see the snow on the mountains there.
Thanks so much. Okay, thanks everyone for watching.